Where did the Israelites cross the sea? Where were Rameses, Pithom, and Mount Sinai? Hello, my name is Nemanja Jurisic, and you're watching NT Podcast Science and Theology. Today we are joined by Dr. Mark Janzen, an Egyptologist, to explore the archaeology and the geography of the Exodus. Dr. Mark, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. Good to be with you.
Thank you also. It's a really big pleasure. And I wrote your book, 5 Views on the Exodus. You were editor. So can you say something about that? Can you say about your biography for audience who don't know you? So yeah.
Okay, yeah. So 5 Views of the Exodus was something I put together with five other experts in the field to discuss the different issues surrounding the details of the Exodus, mostly like the chronology and the different like historicity and where different sites were, all these kind of things come up, but trying to approach it from a data-driven perspective, but one that is also something that people don't have to be a specialist in the field to be able to understand, to get this information out to a broader audience, because what I find all too often happens is the it sounds kind of harsh, but they're kind of amateurs and they have a very loud voice sometimes online, but they're not actually experts. And I do think it's important for us to try to respect the experts in their fields. And us experts in this field don't always do a good job of getting that information out to the interested layperson or the educated layperson. We tend to talk to each other too much and not the rest of the world. So that was the idea behind the book. And then I am an Egyptologist and ancient historian. My terminal degree is a PhD in ancient history with an emphasis on Egypt, and then that's my PhD. And then I also have an MA in archaeology. And then I teach at the Lanier Center for Archaeology at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee. So if you're interested in archaeology, especially at the grad level, we are one of the, I think, best places you can go. Yes, I am definitely biased, but we are in the field a lot. We're in Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Cyprus, although that one's winding down, Kazakhstan. We have a lot of projects, so a lot going on.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much. And we had on our podcast your colleague, Dr. Steve Ortiz. It was wonderful.
Yes.
We talked about United Monarchy. So yeah, he's
Yeah, he's
great.
great. Yeah, he's our director.
Yes, and okay, let's go, Dr. Mark. We have not many time, so my first question for you is, where is Yam Suf or Red Sea? Many would say, the
Okay.
place where the yeah. Okay, go.
So the first thing I always tell people about this discussion is the geography in the ancient world is somewhat different than today. In particular, with this question, the most important part of this is the fact that it's much drier in the region today than it was in the New Kingdom Egypt, which we'll put at, say, 1500 to 1100 just for easy dates, probably 1550 to 1069 to be more precise. But that's middle of the second millennium when it starts. And the reason that matters is the whole area from basically the Mediterranean coast in Egypt down into the Red Sea was very marshy. It was much wetter than it is today. And I know this firsthand. My first excavation was at Tel El Borg in North Sinai, which is kind of very close to the delta. It's by Ismailia, and that was with Jim Hoffmeyer and Tom Davis and others. And what really struck me walking around the desert out there, desert, is all the seashells. And our geologist, Dr. Stephen Mosier, who's at Wheaton, he had done a lot of work doing the coring and determining that this is really a paleo lagoon. So, like in ancient times, even a little further east, but still the same basic region, it was much more watery than it is today. It doesn't get much more obvious on the surface than seashells on the desert. But that means when we try to find Yam Suf, we are sometimes trying to be more precise, perhaps, than we should be. The Bible itself refers to the sea crossing using two phrases. There's the generic term Hayam, the sea, like in Exodus 14:2 and verse 9, verse 16, Numbers 33:8, Psalm 78 uses this term. And then there's the Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds, which is your question, which is basically Exodus 13, Exodus 15, Joshua a couple times, Psalm 136 a couple times. And it is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, that was the first to call it the Red Sea, which means which is Urethra thalassa, and that is where the confusion first started. It never in Hebrew said Red Sea. It said Sea of Reeds. All that intro is to set up this simple point. Because the area was much wetter in ancient times, it was marshy and thus full of reeds, basically all along from the north coast of the Mediterranean all the way down to the Red Sea. So there are then a few different candidates that are possible. We could have it at Timsah Lake or Balak Lake or the Bitter Lakes. And I think it's probably impossible to determine between those options. But what we shouldn't do is look for it in the Gulf of Aqaba or look for it further south into the Red Sea, because the Hebrew actually never said Red Sea. Instead, as you mentioned, it said Yam Suf. Now, as an Egyptologist, I believe that Yam Suf is linguistically comparable to the Egyptian term Pa-Chufi. And so do basically all the Egyptologists that have looked at this, or at least the vast majority. And Pa-Chufi was located in the Near East Delta in what today would be the Isthmus of Suez region, but could also extend further south. And it's basically a term the Egyptians seem to use to mean the environment of the Red Sea up to the Mediterranean, including all these marshy waterways. So again, Timsah Lake, Balak Lake, or the Bitter Lakes are your options there. All of which would be deep enough for the details of the story, by the way. So I think we have options there, but it's not in the Gulf of Aqaba, and I don't even think we have to go as far as the Gulf of Suez. Does that make sense?
Yes, I watched one documentary from Jim Koffmeyer, your colleague.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. He's a good friend and mentor too. He's a real big
oh,
part of why I do this. Love Jim.
yeah, he's a great scholar, and I think I have a sense that he's also a good guy, even if I don't know him. So,
Yeah.
yeah, he comment on El Arish inscription
Hmm.
that is dating from 1st century BC to even 4th century BC. He addressed some things in that inscription, like cut waters, that's Nile, sea, or anything. Moses is described as a prince of desert. Israelites are evil ones, and there is a lake El Balach, so Pi-Hahiroth. Do you agree that that's correct?
Yeah, that's one of the good candidates for the sea crossing, for sure. And so it's those three lakes. And I think it's very difficult from there to really lock it in because the text isn't that precise about what this marshy region, which one is intended. And so then it actually becomes more important to look at the stages of the journey and things like how far they can travel in a day and sort of figure out the itinerary that both Exodus and the Book of Numbers give us. So, and I'm working on a book on that with my friend Chris McKinney. So I kind of take us up to Sinai and he takes us from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. You should have him on sometime too.
Oh yes, of course I will try. So, what is the name of book? I didn't know that.
It's not out yet, so the title's still a work in progress.
Mhm.
But it's going to be basically something about the historical geography of the Exodus and wilderness wanderings or something along those lines.
Yeah, amazing. I can't wait. But my question for Yam Suf, I read in Kenneth Kitchen work that he mentioned there is two Yam Sufs. Is it possible that one term is applied on two separate locations or
That's
rivers or
possible.
anything?
Yeah, there's the later reference that has been puzzling to people for decades. Other people think that that's where they're just actually like alongside it as they're wandering like south in Sinai, which I think is basically the campsite is essentially what's being described. It's the Yam Suf and they're like next to it. And I think that again is because the term can be a broad region. And one of the fundamental problems we have in this discussion is we have to kind of try to think like an ancient and apply terms like an ancient would, and that takes real intentional effort on our part. Um, so, for example, probably the most famous one about this point is the idea of Mount Sinai in Arabia, which I know I'm maybe jumping ahead to a different topic, but people usually base that off of Galatians, where Paul says Sinai's in Arabia, and they think, oh, Arabia. I know where Arabia is, but Arabia in Paul's day covered like 9 different regions. I mean, it's far more than just Saudi Arabia today. And so included that the semantic range of Arabia in Paul's day included the Sinai Peninsula. So that doesn't help us determine the location. And if your location is based mostly on that, there's a good chance you're going to be wrong because we didn't actually think and contextualize the source, in this case, Paul, to his world. Instead, we used ours. And I think that kind of extends to a lot of the toponyms that we look at.
All right, so can we talk about that specific topic? Where would you roughly locate Mount Sinai? Because many would say that that is Jebel al-Lawz or Jebel Makla in Saudi Arabia. So what do you
Yeah.
think?
Gosh, there's a lot wrong with that view. I try to be charitable. But so really that it became more popular with the work of Ron Wyatt. And Ron Wyatt was a nurse anesthetician, always a mouthful for me. And I'm sure he's perfectly, capable there. I'm not trying to throw shade at him, but I think this is a good case though where we have someone with an interest in the topic but not formal training in it and not expertise in it, and then they've popularized this view. And it's like, well, we and people like me and Jim Hoffmeyer, Kenneth Kitchen, David Falk, who I think you've had on, devote years to studying this stuff at the highest academic level to acquire the expertise, much like Ron Wyatt would know how to knock someone out for surgery. You wouldn't want me doing that. I think we don't need him weighing in on where Mount Sinai is because we have plenty of experts. And those experts are those who actually think there is one. So the first point is there's still debate about the historicity of it all. But those of us who take the text as potentially historical pretty much invariably now put it in southern Sinai, not Arabia. So if you don't mind a long-winded answer, let me break down the problems with Mount Sinai in Arabia and their first couple reasons they give, and then I'll break down the problem. So they will usually mention Moses being in Midian after he killed an Egyptian in Exodus 2. I think it's also in Exodus 18, a reference to that. They'll bring up volcanic activity, and they'll mention Galatians 4:25, which we just talked about. The big problems are Moses is linked to both the Midianites and the Kenites, both of which are nomadic. So trying to pin them down to one location is perhaps dubious. In 1892, on the second point, there was volcanic activity in the Sinai Peninsula as well. So that's basically a wash. Also, is it really clear that the text intends these to be taken as natural phenomenon or as theophanies? Right? Or if it's a theophany, then God could just do this wherever he wants, right? So, like, are we reading too much science into a theological passage? That's one other question there. And then again, Arabia of Paul's day is not Arabia of modern vernacular. And then also Wyatt and some of his followers will mention like seeing clefts in the rock and these kind of phenomenon. Well, if you ever visit Sinai, you can basically point to any mountain and find a cleft in a rock. Right? This is coincidental historiography, not scientific data-driven research. It's just some of it's just silly. The idea that I think it's Jebel el-Lawz specifically has this volcanic appearing granite is also not accurate. So I think there's a lot of people who find it compelling and they love the idea and they think what they're doing is bringing biblical passages together, and they're usually well-meaning believers wanting to do that. But there are critical errors with this view. On the other hand, the Southern Sinai theory has quite a bit in favor of it. There are several strong candidates as far as individual mountains go, like Jebel Musa, Jebel Serbal, Jebel Katerina. The region has a long and storied tradition associated with Sinai. We have Nabatean inscriptions from near Jebel Serbal, for example, that date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, invoking safe passage to Mount Sinai for people, implying that they made pilgrimages to where they believed Sinai was. Early Byzantine Christians located it at Jebel Musa, where Christian ascetics were living as early as the 4th century AD. And the quest to visit, I guess you could say, biblical places or places associated with biblical events has remained a constant for Christians as well as Jews and even Muslims to some extent, depending, especially if you're talking about like Moses. And these things usually leave a mark on the landscape. So we see that with some of the monasteries, but they also will tend to pick places they can get to unless they have good reasons to go somewhere really out of the way. So for them to go all the way to southern Sinai, a much more dangerous and difficult journey, suggests that they have good reasons in their own mind for doing this, which is to say they think it's really there. And obviously they are closer in terms of chronology to it. There's also ethno-archaeological and ecological considerations. So, like, if Burckhardt in the 1800s was doing his travels, he noted the Bedouin can strike the rocks in southern Sinai and get water out of them and things like that. Perhaps most importantly, to my mind, is when you look at the average day's journey, like the length of a journey at about 15 miles for an easy estimate, the it's about the right distance from the Sea of Reeds crossing to southern Sinai locations for like the average day's journey. There's numerous mountains with ample rooms for an encampment of a large group of people. And some of the toponyms between Egypt and Sinai suggest Arabic place names, which are, I think, unique to the Sinai Peninsula. So I think the Sinai Peninsula is a pretty strong consensus, though obviously there's still plenty of research to be done. And the individual place names, that's really what we're trying to do in the book, is figure out how many of these can we identify with certainty, and how many of these are tentative, but can we get a decent sort of reconstruction of the route from the ones we're certain about?
Wow, and do we know how great the distance is between Yam Suf and Mount Sinai from the Bible?
No, but we can do it based on the amount of stops they make and how far they could have realistically traveled. There's a lot of data on how far you can travel in the ancient timeline, and then you knock a couple miles a day off of that because they're traveling as a group with women and children and elderly, especially the children and the elderly, making it obviously slower going than an army or a messenger on horse would be more like 20, right? So you'd say 12 to 15, and then you just kind of do the math as you go stop by stop. But you also have to head in a direction. So it's important to, like, okay, if we're going to southern Sinai, how do we get there from the crossing and so on? And that's another big problem with the Arabia view. They'd have to cover way too much ground any given day to get all the way over there. And again, this is just something we acquire as specialists when we go through the data and knowing the text and knowing the descriptions and how long a day could be traveled, or how much travel it could be in a day.
Yes, it makes sense. Thank you. And
Mhm.
now let's talk about Ramses and Pithom. Would you
Yes.
identify those as a Qantir and Tell el-Retabah?
So this is the part that I most enjoy talking about, actually, because everything else I've just basically gone over is, except for the geology of the marshes area, is stacking data, right? Like, okay, if it's this, and then this is the next premise, and this is the next premise, and then we try to reach the conclusion. And of course, the conclusion falls apart if new data invalidates one of the premises. What we're going to talk about now, other than geology that we did earlier, is as firm a footing as we're going to have from Egypt when it comes to the Exodus. So this is like, I enjoy talking about the Exodus period. This would be my pet project with the Exodus, I guess you'd say. Pi-Ramesses is, I think, absolutely located, or was, at Qantir. I should note there's nearly unanimous agreement on this one too. This debate's basically over. So it's a great story, right? The farmer kicks over a block and tells the authorities, and then they excavate and they find a very weird site because there's not very much monumental architecture left, almost no stones because the Egyptians are good little earth citizens, and they recycled everything and moved it north. A lot of it got moved north to Tanis, and so they
Yes, I
get
saw
some.
one statue that is damaged, really. So that's it, I think.
Yeah, and so there's, well, what's so there's a whole history of excavations here that again is kind of a long answer, but they originally realized, oh, this is a huge site. And as new excavations continue, they're realizing it's even larger than they thought. So it was first dug about a century ago by Mahmoud Hamza, an Egyptian archaeologist. And already at that point, they had pretty intriguing results because he'd found the foundations of a royal palace, some Ramesside inscriptions, and most importantly, and this is really, really, really how this works. So this is really important for the audience as well. Hieratic ostracons containing the name Pi-Ramesses. So hieratic is like cursive hieroglyphs. right? If you think of like the hieroglyphs you see on temple walls, the famous version of hieroglyphs, that's like you're typing, right? It's like pretty much a font that they repeat over and over again with minor variants. Hieratic is somebody wrote it by hand, and it's on a potsherd, an ostrakhan, and it has the name Pi-Ramesses. This is every archaeologist's dream, finding the name of the site in situ, in writing, and so that pretty much locked it in for the most part. They also found a bunch of glazed tiles, which were later concluded to be from a palace at Qantir, Pi-Ramesses. And then there was work in the 1950s by Labib Habachi and Shatata Adam that basically confirmed everything Hamza was saying. And then ongoing work in the early 2000s by the German team led by Utger Pusch found stables large enough to support a chariot force of like 460 horses, a large a large foundry for bronze production, a bunch of small finds related to glass production, and what has been called the remains of the first chariot garrison found in the ancient Near East, with a whole bunch of associated military finds like weapons, daggers, lances, arrowheads. If you've seen reconstructions of ancient armor, you'll see it's got like metal scaling. They found a bunch of metal scales that they would like then sew into like the leather chest piece or whatever. They found some of those. Most interesting is maybe the stone molds that they use to make shield rims of the type that we see the Hittites use in the Battle of Kadesh. If you ever wonder how do you mass produce something in the ancient timeline, a stone mold. It's almost like pre-industry. So there's all sorts of small finds. The point is, these small finds, as we would call them in archaeology, are overwhelming compared to the lack of monumental finds or larger features. So that's very curious, but we know this is because they moved the whole city pretty much after the branch of the Nile that it was on dried up between 1150 and 1130 or somewhere around there. And your Ramesside capital on a dried up branch is no longer really a Ramesside capital. So what do? You reuse the blocks. They moved the blocks north to a site called Tanis, which in the Bible is also referred to as Zoan. And if you read your Bible carefully, you'll see Psalm 78 and 105 refer to it as Zoan, because for those later biblical authors, that's what they know it as. So I think it's a really interesting marker of an authentic memory or authentic sources behind the Exodus account that they get the name of this place right as Pi-Ramesses. So
But
I
we
would
have
put
also in the numbers mention Zoan. So why is
mhm.
that
Could be later
different?
editing. There's the whole
Yeah.
compositional history of the Pentateuch, which is a topic for another day, and more of a Hebrew specialist is who you'd want for that. But that Pi-Ramesses is a very intriguing mention, and I don't think the scholars who say, oh, they could have remembered this because it's used later are correct about this. It still strikes me that they wouldn't have known to call it that unless they were retaining a source or an authentic memory of some time spent there, because all the later OT texts call it Zoan. It's only the earlier ones where we think it's Pi-Ramesses. So that's my view of that. And then from Pi-Ramesses, of course, we also have Pithom mentioned in Exodus 1:11. And this is undeniably the Hebrew writing of the Egyptian term Per Atum, which just means house of Atum. So if you just ignore the R, it just drops in the Hebrew in this case, Pithom, Per Atum. It's fairly obvious. Atum, the deity, has a strong presence in the Wadi Tumilat region, which is the wadi that runs east-west from the delta over to Sinai, basically. And this then provides us with a clear, or not quite to Sinai, really to the Yam Suf is what it would run to, just short of getting to the Sinai Peninsula because of all the waterways. And this wadi would be the route they probably take out of Egypt. So we know the etymology of Pithom. It's then very difficult to figure out which site is Pithom as far as the archaeology goes. Okay, and then as you know, the next site is Maskhuta, right? So we need to talk about two different sites, excuse me. Tel el-Retabah and Tel el-Maskhuta. They're both in the Wadi Tumilat. Now, the other biblical toponym is Succoth, which is Cheku in the Egyptian. But this is difficult because Cheku can be in the Egyptian texts either a specific city or a broad or like a fort or a broader region. And I'll usually joke with people, have you ever been to New York? And then they'll answer, and I'll say, okay, but did I mean the city or the state? So, like, any language can do this. In Egyptian, they will often help us with this because they'll put what's called a determinative on the end of the word. And that tells you what kind of thing the word is. So they'll put a city determinative or a land determinative. Hebrew doesn't have these. So one question is Succoth a specific place or just the Wadi Tumilat as a whole? So that's another question. Broadly speaking, if we get back to identifying the sites, I think Pithom is most likely at Tel el-Retabah, which does have in situ New Kingdom Ramesside remains. Mountford Beatock, who's dug in that region for 40 plus years at this point, said this was a strategic site for defending the Wadi and would also put the site of Pithom here at Tel el-Retabah, thus defending basically the Delta region. The excavations then at Maskhuta, so Pithom is Retabah. The excavations then at Maskhuta have been contentious. And I think Succoth is probably at Maskhuta. But in the 70s and 80s, John Halliday excavated, and he said there was a break between the 17th century BC and the 7th century. Thus, he would say he found nothing in the time window for the Exodus. So then, oh, well, it can't be one of the sites. However, more recent excavations have found actually Ramesside remains, and most emphatically, there is a recent tomb discovered in 2010, the tomb of a man named Kenamun, who is a Ramesside official, and his tomb mentions that he is the royal butler, he's the fan bearer of the right king, he's attendant of the lord of the two lands, and he's the king's messenger. So the logic then would go, what's this Ramesside official's tomb doing there if no one's living anywhere near here in the Ramesside era? Obviously, they put the tombs a little bit out of the city, but not in the middle of nowhere. So there is, in fact, Ramesside material at Maskhuta. So I think we go Ramses in Exodus 111 is Qantir. Then Pithom from Ramses 111 is Tel el-Retabah. And then Succoth is either the region, the Wadi Tumilat, or the specific site, Tel el-Maskhuta, with Succoth and Scuto having potentially a linguistic fit as well.
Yes, and what about those guys from Associates for Biblical Research? They would say that Pithom is Tel el-Daba. Would you agree with them?
They are doing that because they think the Exodus dates to the 15th century, or as I would put it, in the 13th. And so that's the fundamental disagreement. And then they're kind of using the archaeology to, that kind of is the assumption that drives the analysis of the archaeology. And for me, their view, which would be Scott Stripling's in the Five Views book, he was great to work with. If people are entitled to have different opinions on these things for certain, but I would find the problem with that view being they lose Pi-Ramesses, which I think is the best piece of evidence we have to try to say there is some contingents of Israelites that experience the Exodus, right? And so to me, I don't want to throw Pi-Ramesses out, especially as an Egyptologist. This is more important data to me than the reference in in 1 Kings 6, when Solomon builds the temple 480 years after the Exodus. To me, that it looks like a distance Angaba, a German word for distance dating practices that the ancients are so fond of. Again, we have to try to think like the ancients thought, where 480 just happens to be 12 times 40. And does that not look just a little bit suspicious? We can take a high view of scripture and still try to think like an ancient Israelite and realize, oh, they might not be as literal with such numbers as we are. 40 being quite obviously very prominent in the Old Testament does make you wonder. The Assyrians do something just like this, same exact context with a temple and everything. When Tukulti-Ninurta I was rebuilding a temple, he said it was 720 years after the event in question. And that would be the same idea, but with the number 60 instead of 40. So this is something ancients do. So I think the tension in the two verses that matter most for chronology, Exodus 1:11 and 1 Kings 6:1, is better resolved by understanding the number is not as literal as we understand numbers. So I would say that those guys are looking at the archaeology from the lens of their pre-commitment to the date. Whereas what I'm trying to do is trying to look at the data cumulatively and trying to think with empathy, like how best we can, how an ancient would have considered something like 480 years.
Yes, I would agree. They shift also City of Ai and others, so
Yes,
maybe
and
that's a
then
good
yeah,
idea. I changed my
have
mind when I,
Steve back
yeah,
on and talk about their use of archaeology in the Southern Levant because
yeah, he said something like they almost worship number 480 years. So that's a really interesting
yes,
one.
and I think it's
But yeah,
because of it, and I understand it as somebody who grew up in a world where those kind of things were the most important thing. The Bible says it, that's good enough. That's kind of the logic. And as I've gotten more, education on these things, I've realized the gaps in culture, the gaps in time period, all the different things that go from their day to ours. Most of the time, we can understand what they mean plainly, but occasionally there are things that we're very different about. And I think precision with numbers would definitely be one of them. Same thing with the census numbers that we get, right? Like two million
yeah.
Israelites, when you do like the women and children, okay, well, they're not going to struggle conquering Canaan. They probably can just conquer Egypt. So something's up. So that this is the kind of thing I'm very much passionate about in my own career, is trying to help us contextualize these things, not because I'm trying to prove the Bible. I am perhaps making a case that it's plausible, but mostly I'm trying to help us read it better, and understand the ancient world that it comes out of before we bring sort of our theological perspectives to it. Let's try to understand it at face value first.
Yes, it makes sense. I changed my mind on this issue when I heard Dr. Falk saying that if you read Exodus alone, you will see 13th century BC because you have
Absolutely.
only geography. So yeah,
Yeah, and that was actually something. The first person I heard say that was actually Jim Hoffmeyer. I was riding in the car with him at a conference, and we were just talking about it. And he's like, what gets me is if you just read the Pentateuch, it's 13th century all the way. I'm like, that's a great point. And so I think what we do, and people don't know quite that they're doing this, perhaps for the most part, like your average like pastor, reverend, etc. They think, oh, the Bible is the inspired word of God, or it's infallible, and they have all these different doctrinal statements about it, and they think that means we can't say something like 480 is symbolic, because they think we're saying that the Bible's wrong. But that's not what we're doing. We're actually saying that our understanding needs to be more nuanced and better fit the Bible's actual world. So it really, if you do have those theological backgrounds and those kind of things in mind, I don't think treating 480 as 12 times 40 does any damage whatsoever to those doctrines.
yeah, it makes sense. Okay, and what do you think about the geography? Does it fits better with 13th century BC or rather 15th century? Can you give arguments that yeah points
So
some time?
in the Sinai, it's probably just a wash because there hasn't really been any full excavations, just surveys. And you'll sometimes hear people say there's no evidence from the Sinai. Well, it's like there's not been enough work to really draw much on the archaeological side. That's why we have to use the toponyms and the distance and the journeys. So either one can pretty much work there. But basically, everything we just went over about Qantir and Maskhuta is Ramesside. So that means late date 13th century. The 14th or the 15th century day, mid 1400s, would be during the reign of Thutmose or Amenhotep II. And that would not have that data because there isn't any 18th dynasty or Thutmose activity at those sites, but there is Ramesside activity. And so the archaeology in the Eastern Delta and in the Wadi Tumilat would also favor the 13th century.
All right, thank you, Dr. Janzen. And now this is comment from well-known and respected scholar, Dr. Ronald Hendel, and
Mhm.
he says that the memory of this city, he means city of Ramses, persisted through much of the first millennium. The Ramesside literary tradition of praising the city of Pi-Ramesses continued up to the 8th century BCE, and as Hofmeier notes, the god Amun of Pi-Ramesses was worshipped in Thebes until Ptolemaic times. The biblical reference to the city of Ramses bears on the antiquity of the memory of this city, but it doesn't mean that the text could have been written only in the second millennium BCE. The memory of this great city lingered for many centuries. It may have lingered in Israelite memory from the time of the Egyptian Empire or been rekindled by Egyptian influence during the first millennium, perhaps during the time of Egyptian hegemony over Israel, as occurred in the late 7th century BCE. In any case, the memory of the great city of Ramses persisted. So, what is your comment on this?
I mean, I don't know that it persisted for a biblical author, though, because they called it Zoan later. That's like the major issue with that view, I think, is why would they switch the term later if they still in Israel remembered it? The Egyptians remembering it is a much different thing. And if there's not been Israelites really traveling to Egypt much other than, Jeroboam briefly and all and those kind of things, but as a large group, they really hadn't been, then I would question how the Israelites have that memory. Though I mean, it's certainly possible, but I think at the end of the day, this is mostly an attempt to minimize the impact of Pi-Ramesses on the historicity, but I don't think it necessarily has to be, I don't think you have to have a combative view to embrace cultural memory and the idea that Pi-Ramesses is historically important. Does that make sense? So that it's sometimes this idea that cultural memory must mean that there is no authentic memory. But I think they took these things much more seriously than maybe we would today in terms of trying to remember their own history and their own past. But I think the Pi-Ramesses point that he is making is not something that a lot of Egyptologists would go so far with, saying that it's clearly remembered for and across the whole ancient Near East, like maybe within Egypt. And I don't think that it's particularly a strong case. But that's the thing with cultural memory. It's kind of it's a very, very interesting idea. And it certainly seems to me that it must be part of the conversation in some way, shape, or form because of how complex it is by the time the text is finalized. But it's often difficult to pin down exactly what its impact is. And Hendel's view was in the book as well, and he was a joy to work with. He was very, prompt with everything, wrote really well. And I thought, I give him a lot of credit for being the one sort of more so dissenting voice in that book, which is not an easy thing to take on. But I do think there's some kind of like this cultural memory approach merges these different aspects of history and narrative imagination into this powerful cultural memory. Sometimes history and fiction get merged, and it's ends up with this sort of messy approach to trying in terms of trying to figure out what's historical and what's not. Whereas when we look at Pi-Ramesses and we have so much precise detail in the archaeological record, and then full stop, it's removed as a city because of the Nile drying up. That is so precise, right? And like cultural memory doesn't have specific sources in mind, and yet we have something very precise with Pi-Ramesses. It's almost like we're speaking two different languages. Does that make sense? It's tricky
Yeah.
to address compared to the rest of this for sure.
Yeah, so what is your opinion when you read this text from Torah and the geography? Do you think that later editors and writers could invent something that seems like historical, but actually it's not quite? So, do you sense something about that?
Great question. That's kind of, in a lot of ways, I think that is what's underlying some of the cultural memory. And it's not an accusation. I don't think they're trying to do that. I don't think they're being as sinister as maybe some of my colleagues might think. I think it probably depends on the individual. So I don't want to call them extreme minimalists or something. But I think getting details like Pi-Ramesses right in its use of when it's time window for use is so small. And yeah, even if some cultural memory of it persists, we see the Bible calling it Zoan. Okay, that's the main point. And then secondly, I think it is hard for me to find a parallel, perhaps you know of one, where a culture searches for its origin story and comes up with something where they are dominated by the stronger power for any length of time until their deity saves them. And then their ancestors can't actually keep the covenant they form with that deity for anything and all have to die before the next generation can settle in their land. I mean, usually origin stories are much grander and they celebrate the ancestors, not critique them. So in terms of like, maybe this is more like a cultural anthropology point, but I feel like the idea that the whole thing is entirely fictitious would make for a relatively absurd origin story. But we also have to have good high standards for what we call evidence and data, and we don't have definitive proof. We have circumstantial evidence, like why is this in the text if they weren't ever in Egypt? And that demonstrates plausibility, not definitive proof. So to me, the idea that they make the whole thing up out of thin air is very hard to accept because it's such a ridiculous origin story. Like think about Roman origins. Truthfully, the Romans have no idea what their origins are. So they give us the story of Romulus and Remus. And later they give us the Aeneid. And these things glorify at least some of the ancestors in the past. And you could say Moses is put on a pedestal, except for he doesn't enter the promised land ultimately. So if they are doing this as a fictitious origin story, it's a extraordinarily unique one in human history. If instead some group of them really were in Egypt and they contain authentic memory of that or authentic sources of that, I think that's a better explanation. Is it perfect? No, because we don't have definitive proof and we probably won't get that based on the nature of evidence. But I think it's more plausible that some of them were there. Another piece of data that we haven't mentioned in the story of Moses's birth, the cluster of verses there have 5 or 6 Egyptian loanwords involving Egyptian geography, reeds, rushes, the word for pitch, and so forth, like basic mundane terms, but they're Egyptian terms. And it would be strange to think that that could happen if they hadn't spent some time in Egypt.
Yes, amazing point. Okay, so my question is, I remember when Dr. Benjamin Sommer said that you cannot find in pair city of Ramses and Pithom. So that's two cities mentioned together only in the time of Ramses II and Merneptah. So even if we have mention of Ramses later, we don't have those pairs only
Right.
from 13th century. So do you think it's plausible explanation?
Yes,
Yeah.
yep. And also the notion that they're building store cities is worth mentioning, whereas the semantic range of that word ear doesn't have the Hebrew doesn't have something like we would think of it maybe like a silo in an anachronistic sense today. They're probably, and I think this is a point Kitchen made all the way back in the 70s, but definitely in his book on the reliability of the Old Testament record in 2003, that these are storage installations probably attached to temples and palace, and we do find those in the archaeological record at various sites in Egypt. And so the granary is the temple for the most part. They control most of that. And so the idea that they would build something like that is much more likely than building a whole city from scratch for them. But again, this is a phenomenon very well attested in the Ramesside era as well. But yeah, I think he's right. What you just outlined, that combination is a good point.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Hendel would say that, okay, we have papyri from 13th century BCE, I think in the time of Seti, Pharaoh. So we have two slaves escaping the Sinai Peninsula. So he would say, okay, we have two people or even some others that escaped, but that's not Exodus in the sense we have large group leaving Egypt. So what would you say on that argument when he says that was a really small few people just?
Well, so you're talking about, I think, Papyrus Anastasi the 5, which is from
Yes.
the reign of Seti the second, who's the successor of Merneptah, but we're still in that same broad chronological window, definitely. And There, the commander tracks them down and he asks where they've been, and he goes to these different forts. And I think Hendel might be. I don't want to try to read his mind, but let me back up. Hoffmeyer's point on this is that this shows that there is an established route that people try to use to get out of Egypt in a hurry. Like in a pinch, this is the route you take. And it goes through these different forts that are basically right there where the Exodus itinerary puts them as well. His point is not a large group of people would do the exact same every little single step, but more so like this is the flavor of what's happening here. And I think that's important to know. And then the other point I would make is more like a broad logic kind of one, and just kind of trying to be humorous here. Yes, it's not an ancient interstate, but there's also only so many routes. So there's no way for us to tell how wide some of the parts of that route would be. But the point is, the terrain allows foot traffic. So I live near Nashville, and thousands of people use these same roads, but you could also just use it with one vehicle. You know what I mean? Like the route's the route. If the geography limits the route, then that's going to put the parameters for the route in place. And yeah, it's hard to say how wide it is or how many people could use it. And yes, obviously, it's not a text referencing thousands, but that was never Hoffmeyer's point anyway. He was simply saying this is the the route basically, or this is the route based on apparently geographic realities. And we do see the Egyptians talking about this as one of the ways out. And I would add that our author in Exodus notes this dilemma. Why do they need the miracle at the sea? Because the route's not good enough for them to go fast enough, / there's too many of them. Like this is already admitted, and actually quite famously. So I don't think that point really means a whole lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good point. I didn't think that way, but yeah. Okay, I
And
have
also
just
there's
few.
not 2 or 3 million of them. Like that's really important. We're
Oh
talking
yeah.
a couple tens of thousands or something. It's hard to say, but that Hebrew term that we translate thousands can mean military commander, military unit. It's like homonym. It's like the word bark in English. Context would normally help you, but we're in a military context in the book of Numbers, which means it can still be kind of fuzzy. But like if I say that my dog barked, you don't think he did something with the exterior of a tree because you immediately know what I mean. And so I think our biblical translations, the good ones, will note that there's options here. And it's really important, I think, for people to realize that we don't need millions. There's ways to understand that fit the rest of the data better.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much, Dr. Jansen. Just a few identifications of locations, and we can wrap up the interview.
Alrighty.
So I have a question for cities such as, okay, we covered Succoth, but what about Pi-Hahiroth and Migdol? Where would you locate them?
These are tricky. um, this is they're really a cluster of toponyms describing that next leg of the journey after the Wadi Tumilat that we mentioned earlier. So according to Exodus 14:1, and I'm actually using my notes here for the book because this one's so much more convoluted. They camped, quote, in front of Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon. So you give 3 sites to try to tell you what one place where we are. That's immediately significant, as the author apparently realizes this might need clarification. So note that they don't actually stop at any one of those. They stop somewhere in between them, and he's trying to like triangulate it for us. So I think that's already really interesting. Migdol simply means tower, which is equated with the Egyptian word Megdar, as the Egyptians don't have an L. Again, this is unanimous. And that's a type of military fortification. Ellen Morris, a well-known Egyptologist who literally wrote the book on New Kingdom imperial architecture and fortifications, says that they are very limited in their distribution, these kind of Migdol towers. Outside Egypt, they're only found in northern Sinai. 1 or 2 are situated along the ways of Horus, which is actually where we would be in this case. So like basically it's saying the tower. And it's okay, not terribly specific, right? It's like when Joshua and the Israelites go to Ai, after Jericho, right? And in Hebrew, I just means ruin. So it's just still, well, which ruin? The text sometimes isn't very clear. Um, as for Pi-Hahiroth, the consensus I think is emerging about its meaning. If it's a Semitic word, then it means mouth of the canal. And this suggestion is bolstered considerably by the discovery of a canal on the eastern frontier of Egypt that ran from Timza Lake to at least the southern end of the Bala Lakes. And it measured 70 meters by 20 and was almost 3 meters deep. So, like, this is a man-made New Kingdom canal. And if he says they're at the mouth of the canal, now that would be much more specific. And so, to answer your question, ultimately, I think what we're doing here is we're probably parked somewhere near the Bala Lake along that canal. And then Baal Zephon is basically Baal of the north. That's also difficult to identify. Some identify it with Tel Daphne because of a 6th century letter sent there from there, to Memphis, wishing blessings from Baal Zephon. Of course, the problem with that is it's going to Memphis, and it just mentions the worship of Baal Zephon at Tel Daphne or Tiffany's, not that it's actually the name of it. So there's much more work to be done on Baal Zephon in particular, but I think Pi-Hahiroth is probably the best toponym to trying to unlock that little mysterious triangle there, which is, of course, a major part of trying to figure out where the Sea of Reeds is, too.
Yeah, it is tough to recognize those places, but okay. Okay, now Jim Hofmeyer stated that out of approximately 35 locations listed in the numbers 33, we have identified only about 7. So, could you tell us more about Elim? That's a famous place with 70 palm trees and
Yeah.
12 springs. So, where would you locate that?
I would put it basically down by Sinai in the southern Sinai Peninsula. It is, again, not so methodologically, we are always at the mercy of the data, which people may like find that somewhat frustrating, but it is nonetheless the case. What we would like to do is say, okay, it's clearly here, here, and here for the next however many sites, but we don't have full excavations, right? Funding, logistics, it's all very much way more difficult than, say, excavating in a more prominent area that's easier to get to. And then we have to do historical geography, which usually is a combination of all the different types of data, plus toponyms, plus what explorers in the past said, and looking at what the Bedouin do. Some of this we've mentioned earlier. And so we end up having to conclude that these places are far less certain, though not impossible to make a case for, but they aren't going to be as verifiable as, say, Pi-Ramesses. And so for Elim, I would put it basically, and the same thing with Marah and these other places where you're like, ooh, there's the, Ayin Musa, Spring of Moses. Ooh, is that connected to the Exodus? So we get all these things where you're trying to figure out, are people with their naming conventions that sometimes do last thousands of years conveying an accurate memory or not? That's really the central question. So if you think you give them the benefit of the doubt, then you can try to place some of these. And again, it's also in keeping with the realities about a day's journey and other things we haven't talked about. Like I mentioned it in passing on Sinai, but ecological factors like access to water and so on. You have, of course, the reference to all the palm trees in Exodus 15, which would fit as well. And so for that leg of the journey, we're on less firm ground, admittedly, but I do still think you can come up with a scenario that is at least plausible. And then it's kind of about how much emphasis you want to put on those kinds of data pieces. Whereas when we're talking like, oh yeah, they have in situ an ostracon with the site name on it. Well, that's a wrap. You know what I mean? You're done at that point. That's exactly what we want for all of them. So I think it's really important to understand the way the data works at the end of the day on every stop from the sea to Sinai, and most of the stops from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. But I know Jim Hoffmeyer's Israel and Egypt is about to receive its 2nd edition, and I am curious if he will have bumped that number up any, and I haven't actually thought to ask him. So, but what Dr. McKinney and I are doing is trying to put these toponyms together and give you a more plausible case for some of these places. Then it certainly wouldn't count as definitive proof. I want to be careful with that. That's usually lacking in our world.
Yes, thank you so much. And don't you agree that if we have a text in Bible that mentions 12 springs and palms, that could be easy to identify? We should only find place where we have 12 springs today. So is that a clue?
I think it is a clue. And I think we have to, more than anything, put it in its cultural context too. And even just narrative context. What would it mean after all the wandering and all the struggles that they've gone through to trying to get to Sinai, that they find a place like that? It would be a vast significance to them. So much so that we see it, that passage in Exodus into 15, I believe, on mosaic floors from millennia later, right? Like into the 3rd, 4th centuries AD, in synagogue floors are mosaics of the Palm Springs at Elim. So this part of the memory lingers for sure. And so we get all these different kind of layers of data trying to, piece together the whole story. And I think we have to also be humble enough to note that we aren't going to necessarily always have definitive proof or always have the full answer, but we can make, I think, compelling cases for the vast majority of them, but definitely not with full certainty.
Yes, but we again have 70 to 12, so that's
Yeah.
again numbers that are important to them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's symbolically significant, perhaps. You never know if they mean, I don't suppose they, got out a piece of chalk and wrote down which number the tree was, and we're like, oh, there's 70 of these, We have to think, what do they mean by that? It's the same thing with Ramses, or Amenhotep II, or Thutmose III's campaigns, and they bring back all these captives. What do we do with this? Is it literal? When the Greeks tell us they killed however many thousands of Persians, is that literal? So I think we could do this with any number of ancient sources when we get those kind of details. And it's important for us to perhaps not just think like an ancient, but try to be careful in how we formulate our even broadest answers of what they're doing with numbers, and try to think about the logistics of it. But yeah, the 12
Yes.
springs, the 70 palms in Elim is obviously a very intriguing reference. And I just looked it up again to refresh my own memory of which verse, but Exodus 15:27 and 6 through 16:1 is obviously what we're talking about here. So that was in Exodus 15:22. It was noted that it was 3 days in the wilderness of Shur without finding water before they came to Marah. There they find water, but it's bitter, leading to the name Marah, which means bitter. Okay, and so that's like all the dilemma they're facing is they finally get water and it's no good, and then finally they get to Elim, and this is otherwise unattested, the terms. The other reference in the Bible is Numbers 33:9, the other big itinerary reference. So both of it mention the springs and the palms. It's been identified since the 19th century, to try to give you a little bit more precise on the answer, with the Wadi Garandal, which had acacia, tamarisks, and palm trees and ample water, though Edward Robinson, in the 1800s did note that the water was brackish. But that's the kind of ecological observations we get that give us at least some idea, but not perfect. But then when they have to get water out of the rock, it helps us to understand why they have to do that, because even when they think they have water, it's actually not drinkable.
So is it plausible in the Sinai Peninsula to have a bitter water to find like that in Marah?
Yeah, I believe so, because you'll have it coming off the coast and it'll like come up from the ground, but it will be salt essentially mixed in with it.
Mhm.
Yeah. So but in terms of us trying to find the springs, because of course the springs would be drinkable, there just hasn't been that kind of research done. And I don't know if geologically they would be the same. You would need a geologist there. But the idea that there's palm trees in the region and there is enough water to support that is definitely there. And it's because the rocks absorb it. It doesn't just run off, which is fascinating. They're
Yes, and
porous.
what about names of those places? Elim, Marah, Desert of Sin, Rephidim, Desert of Etam or Shur. Are those
Yeah.
Egyptian or not?
Some they might be. I know it's a bad answer, but that's the case. So let's go like Dovka. Okay, Dovka is often equated to the Egyptian term Mefkat, which means turquoise. And so the idea would be, oh, Sirba el-Qadim, the big mining site in Sinai that the Egyptian used to get some of their turquoise, and some people want to connect it to there. But the problem is an Egyptian M never appears in Hebrew with a D, to put it in English terms. So we can't use that to identify it. So like some of them appear to be very, very similar, but not quite locked in. Um, However, when Mefkat is spelled with the land determinative, back to the determinatives thing that I mentioned earlier, meaning it's a place name, the Egyptians put it at the Wadi Megara. So there's a different determinant when they want to talk about Sirbet versus Wadi Megara. When spelled that way, it means a region, not the product turquoise. So again, it's another homonym. And that's actually pretty interesting. So if we place Dofka in the region of that wadi, but not at Sirbet el Qadim, it's just 12 miles from the last stop, and it's just 3 days to two of the better candidates for Sinai, the mountain itself, Jebel Sirbal and Jebel Musa. So now we're trying again, kind of triangulating things down. So I think this is a good example because it's got a linguistic connection, but it doesn't work perfectly. But a different linguistic point gets us in the right ballpark. And then we turn to the day's journey and the water sources and all that. Muchiki, who really wrote the book on Semitic loanwords in Egyptian and vice versa, he also connects it to Nofek. And he says that, well, the Egyptian, that the Hebrew term Nofek is originated from the Egyptian term Mekhat. So we know that they're getting this turquoise linguistically from the Egyptian term. It's just where are they referring to? And it's probably somewhere in the Wadi Magara. Others then connect it to all the things with the turquoise and the priestly garments. And these kind of things are maybe more like tantalizing than they are definitive, but they are pretty interesting. As for Rephidim, which I think you mentioned as well, you get the Wadi Ferran, which seems like it could be a linguistic fit. And there's also another Wadi Rephaid. Also seems like a linguistic fit. You see where this is going. Early Christians, undertook pilgrimages to Wadi Ferran in the 3rd century. It's also where many believe the Israelites fight the Amalekites in Exodus 17. And Wadi Ferran remained a popular choice for Rephidim among both the early pilgrims and more recent researchers. It does have a spring, the Ayin Ferran, which is a rich oasis, which also has palm trees. However, the big problem with that is if you read the story in full, it is at Rephidim that the people once again quarrel with Moses over a water shortage. So for where the springs are, right, why are we quarreling with Moses over a water shortage? Kasuto said that's because the water dried up, which any given point I suppose is possible. So if they expected well watered and then found it dried up, you could see their anger. But geologist Philip Lamoureux explains that the igneous formations accumulate shallow groundwater. Bedouin know how to tap that and crack the rock, is what we referenced earlier, just giving you more of the details. So this all leads Davies to connect Rephidim with Wadi Rephayat that I mentioned a minute ago, believing that the Arabic preserves the ancient Semitic Hebrew toponym. And again, it's the same point as before, where like logistically it works in terms of the distances. So we got 2 locations for Rephidim. So it's kind of funny. Sometimes we don't have a good one at all, and sometimes we get one. It's like actually there's 2, and there's no real good way to precisely determine which. And that's just how we have to be willing to kind of work and live in that uncertainty.
Yeah, that's reality. So it makes sense. Yes, about the desert of Sin and Shur, can you identify those?
The the regions are even harder because they don't have boundaries and borders, right? Like, what do they mean exactly by these terms is kind of the first point. Um, so there's the wilderness of Shur. Is that the one you're referencing?
Yes, we have
That's
Wildra,
that's
Shur
five
or
other
Etham.
times total in the Bible. Right, Genesis 16, and then there's one where Abraham settled in the Negev between Shur and Kadesh. We're trying to figure out what that means. Genesis 20. Um, Basically, the answer to this is the meaning of it is uncertain. Some think it relates to the Semitic word for wall, like potentially referencing the Egyptian walls of the ruler, but this is not likely because we're in Sinai, and the Bible already calls that the way of the Philistines. So we think in the book, Chris and I think that it's the road running along the mountain range east-west that marks the beginning of the geographical formation of the Teach Plateau, which you can also see Hoffmeyer agrees with that as well. Sure is clearly in Sinai, but beyond that, I think it's pretty hard to say. It could very well be, and I know Jim thinks this from his most recent talk that I heard, that it runs in the middle of Sinai, and you take it for a little while, and then you head south if you're getting to a southern Mount Sinai, which seems to be what the Israelites are doing. Um, so it's almost like it runs parallel, but further south, but parallel to the way of the Philistines. And I think he puts it at like 30 miles south of it. But the meaning of the term, we don't 100% know. And usually, if we don't know exactly what they mean by the term, it's going to be nearly impossible to track it in the modern Arabic.
Yes, and would we expect even if Israelites really were in Sinai Peninsula that we can identify all places, or is it more realistic to not identify those places because they are so small, we don't know what they mean by those terms. So we should expect to be hard to identify even 20 or more places out of 35.
Especially when we haven't done anything but very broad surface surveys in Sinai. Yes. And then, mostly what we can do with archaeology is tells that have obvious occupation through the centuries, or we can look at settlement patterns and we can track human activity where there's lots of it. It's much more difficult. I mean, you can find it occasionally, but to find nomads and people wandering in the archaeological record. So the way I always put the point you're making is we need to have realistic expectations. And so just because we can't precisely figure out what site is intended doesn't mean that they were making it up. It's just the limits of the data. But yeah, it's definitely harder when we get out of Egypt because they have so many more sources for us, of course.
Okay, and Dr. Mark, please last my question about turquoise. I read Kitchen. He says something like that after, I believe, 12th century BC or something like that. We don't have any turquoise mentioned, or I forgot really. So, can you comment on that specific detail? Because he wants to say that that's Egyptian loan word, and also that fits to that period. So.
Yeah, so I I think you're referencing his point that this is when they mainly will borrow the word and use it because in Egypt they stopped using it. So as with basically anything else that involves Egypt, Kenneth Kitchen is pretty stinking reliable, and his passing is a great loss for all of ancient history and the studies of ancient history. But yeah, it's very similar to the point about like Pi-Ramesses, where you have a window of use for something. In this case, the word, and the more ubiquitous mining activity. And so he would be arguing that they get this word because they were there in Egypt at the time that they were still doing this so much and using that word. But yeah, I would agree with him.
All right. So, can you give us some final word, any conclusion out of all this we talked about? So, what is your
Yeah,
message?
so at the end of the day, I think there is a contingent of Israelites in Egypt. I think there's enough Egyptisms, let's call them, and circumstantial evidence to suggest that they have a strong familiarity with Egypt that is best explained by having spent some time in Egypt. And definitive proof is not what I'm talking about here. We don't have that. Even if we did, I'm not quite sure what that would look like. So like if we had Moses was here on a rock, I can imagine the reaction. Oh, it's a fake. It's not that Moses. It doesn't prove anything about Moses. You know what I mean? Like we have to have realistic expectations. And I would just encourage your audience to continue to consult the experts, read Kitchen and Hoffmeyer for there is a historical Exodus perspective, but also read broadly and read the other side of it and see who you think presents a more compelling case with more actual ancient data and not just consulting only one or two of the source types. We need to do basically all of it. And I hope that's come out in the interview. And I hope it's also clear that the only approach that will work is case by case, place by place. Broad strokes won't do because the data at any given place is very different potentially. So like lots of data at Pi-Ramesses, very little at Elim, and we just have to live in that reality.
All right, Dr. Mark Janzen, thank you so much for your time and expertise and wisdom. I really enjoyed and learned much. So we tackled key Exodus mysteries. So dear audience, please comment below. What do you think about this? Subscribe to the channel, donate to support more expert discussions. So see you next time on the Anti Podcast.